Hi guys, in this video we're looking at Mary Queen of Scots and the Catholic threat from the Elizabethan England topic in your exams. Let's jump in. So these are the list of things we're going to cover today. Firstly, who was Mary Queen of Scots? What was her claim to the English throne? And then we'll go through all the main events in the story of Mary and Elizabeth. This includes Mary's imprisonment, the Northern Rebellion of 1569, the excommunication of Elizabeth, the anti-Catholic acts of 1581, the early assassination attempts on Elizabeth's life, the anti-Catholic laws of 1585, the Babington Plot of 1586, and Mary's execution. Mary Queen of Scots was born in 1542 and died in 1587. She was the cousin of Queen Elizabeth. She was also the granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, who was Henry VIII's sister. She was also the only child of King James V of Scotland, who was born in 1512 and then became king 17 months later, until his death in 1542. Mary was a strong Catholic, and many Catholics in England wanted her to replace Elizabeth. Mary's father James died just 6 days after Mary was born. As James's only child, Mary became Queen of Scotland at just 6 days old. As Mary was just a newborn baby, her mother, Mary of Guise, acted as regent. Mary of Guise was a powerful noblewoman in France, and she wanted her daughter, Mary Queen of Scots, to marry the heir to the French throne, to create an alliance between France and Scotland. Mary Queen of Scots was raised in France, and at age 15 she married the heir to the French throne. This was in 1558, the same year Elizabeth becomes Queen of England. In 1560, Mary's husband dies and Mary returns to Scotland. Mary wanted Elizabeth to name her as the heir to the English throne, but Elizabeth refused. Elizabeth feared that naming Mary as her heir would lead to Catholic plots to overthrow or assassinate her to make Mary queen quicker. In 1565, 5 years after the death of her previous husband, Mary marries the Scottish nobleman Lord Darnley. Eventually, Darnley suspected Mary of having an affair with her personal secretary, David Rizzio, which leads Darnley and a group of Scottish noblemen to stab Rizzio to death. And in 1567, Darnley was suspiciously murdered. Many believe it may have been Mary and her new lover, the Earl of Bothwell, who murdered Darnley. When Mary married the Earl of Bothwell, many Scottish nobles disapproved and rebelled against Mary. When the nobles rebelled, they managed to imprison Mary. However, in 1568, Mary escapes prison and raises her own army. However, when this army is defeated, Mary flees to England. Mary hopes that Elizabeth, who disapproved of the Scottish nobles overthrowing Mary, would help her to regain control of Scotland, but Elizabeth refused. Elizabeth believed that Mary regaining power in Scotland would increase the risk of a Scottish invasion due to Mary's claim to the English throne. Instead, Elizabeth has Mary imprisoned, and an inquiry is set up to investigate Mary's role in the murder of Darnley. Some letters between Mary and Bothwell were presented in court, which implicated them both in the murder of Darnley. These letters became known as the casket letters. However, there is some debate over whether these letters were forged or were genuine. Elizabeth's ideal outcome of the inquiry was that no verdicts would be reached, so she could keep Mary in captivity and prevent her from plotting to overthrow her. This is exactly what happened. No verdict was reached and Mary stayed in captivity. Tensions escalated further in 1569 during the Northern Rebellion. This was the most serious rebellion in the entirety of Elizabeth's reign. This was an attempted uprising by Catholic nobles in the north of England, who wanted to restore Catholicism in England by replacing Elizabeth with Mary Queen of Scots. So what caused this anger in the Northern Rebellion? Well, Elizabeth confiscated large amounts of land from the Earl of Northumberland and gave this land to his direct rival, and also a Protestant in the south of England. Elizabeth also pocketed the profits of the copper mines on Northumberland's confiscated estates. Elizabeth also used the Council of the North, which was mainly controlled by Southern Protestants, to reduce the power of northern nobles and increase her personal control over the north. The northern nobles also disliked many of Elizabeth's advisors, like William Cecil. And so England's richest landowner, the Duke of Norfolk, plotted to marry Mary Queen of Scots, thinking this would confirm Mary as the heir to the English throne. This plan was supported by Catholic nobles in the north, like the Earl of Northumberland and the Earl of Westmoreland. However, when the plan was foiled, the earls were scared they were going to be executed as punishment, and so they tried desperately to overthrow Elizabeth. The earls managed to capture Durham in November 1569. Then they headed for Tutbury, where Mary was imprisoned. However, they fled when the army confronted them. The Earl of Westmoreland was lucky enough to flee abroad. However, Northumberland was executed, alongside 400 rebel troops. The Northern Rebellion was a major threat to Elizabeth, and highlighted how Mary would always be a threat while she was alive to Elizabeth's reign. And if Protestants disliked Catholics before this, they hated them now. The Protestants felt very strongly they did not want another Catholic monarch, especially after the times of Mary I, when she burned many of them at stake for being heretics. There were some silver linings for Elizabeth. She managed to confiscate many of the nobles' lands as punishment, which increased her control and influence over the north of England. The Council of the North also got a new leader after this, a Puritan, Henry Hastings, the Earl of Huntingdon. Now let's look at the excommunication of Elizabeth. In 1570, the Pope declared Elizabeth a heretic and expelled her from the Catholic Church in a papal bull of excommunication. Following the Northern Rebellion, and now Elizabeth's excommunication, she became less tolerant of Catholic recusants. Her attitude had changed. She was tolerant beforehand because she believed that English Catholicism would die out. However, she could see that tensions were just rising more and more. And so this changing attitude from Elizabeth led to the Treason Acts of 1571. This made it an offence to deny Elizabeth as the Queen of England. In 1574, Elizabeth faces a new threat from missionary priests. These were newly trained Catholic priests who began to arrive in England and secretly minister to English Catholics. And from 1580, the Pope was sending specially trained priests called Jesuits to aid them in doing this. Elizabeth viewed this as a threat to her religious settlement and her authority, and she responded quite harshly. For example, she had missionary Edmund Campion executed for treason in December 1581. This also encouraged the passing of the Anti-Catholic Acts in the same year. Elizabeth increased the fines for recusancy to £20 per month, and there were fines and imprisonments for attending Mass. It was now considered treason, which was punishable by death, to convert to Catholicism or persuade others to do the same. Any rebels would face the death penalty. From 1571, Elizabeth's worst fears come true, as the assassination attempts begin. These attempts are supported by the Pope and Catholic rulers around the world, for example King Philip II of Spain. The main plots to remember are the Ridolfi Plot of 1571, the Throckmorton Plot of 1583, and the Babington Plot of 1586. However, all these plots failed. This was partly due to a lack of public support for Catholic revolution, as shown in the Northern Rebellion. However, the role of Elizabeth's principal secretary, Francis Walsingham, was also crucial, as he used espionage or spying to detect and prevent assassination plots. The Catholic murder of Dutch Protestant leader William of Orange led to the anti-Catholic laws of 1585. Part of this was the Bond of Association, which stated if Elizabeth was murdered, the government would not only go after the murderers, but also anyone who benefited from Elizabeth's death. They also passed a law stating that Mary Queen of Scots would not be allowed to become queen if Elizabeth was assassinated. They also ordered that all missionary priests leave the country within 40 days or face execution. Now let's look at the most famous plot that resulted in Mary's execution. It was Francis Walsingham's use of espionage that led to Mary's role in the plot being unearthed. The Babington Plot was a plot for Sir Anthony Babington to help Mary escape from prison and then kill Elizabeth. Mary had previously avoided punishment for being involved in assassination plots. This was due to Elizabeth's reluctance to execute a legitimate monarch and the risk of fueling further plots against her. However, Elizabeth had little choice this time but to put Mary on trial. The jury found Mary guilty of treason in October 1586. Both Parliament and the Privy Council wanted Mary executed to weaken the Catholic threat and protect the religious settlement. And so Mary was beheaded, and Babington was hanged, drawn and quartered. The Catholic threat was weakened, as the Catholics now had no obvious contender to replace Elizabeth with. However, Mary's execution angered King Philip II of Spain and increased his motivations to invade, at a time when England and Spain were already at war with each other. Let's go through some top banned phrases to use when discussing Mary Queen of Scots in your exam. Catholics posed a significant threat to Elizabeth's reign. However, this threat exponentially increased when Mary Queen of Scots came to England. The arrival of Mary Queen of Scots was a turning point in the Catholic threat, as Mary was the figurehead for Catholic rebels who wanted to restore Catholicism in England after the religious settlement. Elizabeth had reinstated Protestantism as the official religion of England. However, she was originally tolerant of Catholic recusants in order to avoid further religious tensions. However, Mary's claim to the English throne led to increased religious hostilities, which forced a more authoritarian approach from Elizabeth towards rebels. This is evidenced by the Northern Rebellion in 1569, as this uprising by the Earls of the North to confirm Mary as Elizabeth's heir contributed to the passing of the Treason Acts of 1571 and the Anti-Catholic Acts of 1581. These acts were passed by Elizabeth to minimise the ever-growing Catholic threat. The threat of Catholic plots against Elizabeth increased in severity over time. When assassination plots such as the Ridolfi Plot in 1571 were foiled, Elizabeth was forced to introduce further anti-Catholic laws in order to avoid her monarchy being overthrown. This led to the Anti-Catholic Laws of 1585, which included giving Catholic priests 40 days to leave England or face execution. The most significant plot for the future of the Catholic threat was the Babington Plot of 1586, which resulted in Mary being executed for being a conspirator. The Babington Plot resulted in the sobering realization that Mary's staying alive would eventually lead to Elizabeth being killed, as well as ending Protestantism in England. Therefore, Mary's death was the only way for Elizabeth to ensure that the domestic Catholic threat was permanently crushed. Let's finish by going over some common exam questions on Mary Queen of Scots and some possible answers. A short question might be, describe one feature of the Babington Plot. For this, you could talk about Sir Anthony Babington and his role, or the outcome of the plot, with Mary being executed. A long question might be, explain what was important about Mary Queen of Scots' presence in England between 1568 and 1587. This is slightly similar to the next question. Explain why the Catholic threat to Elizabeth I increased after 1566. So both of these questions are similar because they both involve you linking Mary Queen of Scots' arrival in England with the increase in the Catholic threat. So you can use the events from today in chronological order to describe how this threat increased over time and became more severe, culminating in Mary's execution by Elizabeth. And finally, the main cause of tension between Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots was Mary's claim to the English throne. How far do you agree? To argue in favour of this statement, you can talk about how many events, such as Northern Rebellion, were centred around Mary replacing Elizabeth on the throne. However, you can also argue against the line of argument in the question by talking about, for example, religious factors and the religious turmoil of the country for a long time that led to an increase in tensions between Catholics and Protestants. Another factor is the assassination attempts, which did not always involve Mary. There were other people involved who wanted to kill Elizabeth. However, most of the points you will argue will in some way link to Mary's claim to the English throne, so you can use this as a reason to explain why you believe this was the main cause of tension. And this brings us to the end of Mary Queen of Scots in the Elizabethan England topic. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and I'll see you all in the next video.